Welcome to Westminster Watch, and I'm Nick de Bois. On this week's show, we're looking at whether Britain should offer reparation payments or an apology for the country's historical involvement in the slave trade. Last year, a UN judge said the UK could owe more than $23 trillion in reparations for its role in slavery. But that doesn't necessarily mean the government would have to pay that eye-watering amount. Reparatory justice could also mean a formal apology, running educational programmes, or providing public health support or debt relief. The Prime Minister faced pressure from 14 Caribbean countries who want the UK to commit to reparations, but Keir Starmer's already ruled out what he calls very long, endless discussions about the past. Our reporter, Tom Sullivan, explains.
Sometimes sorry seems to be the hardest word, and sometimes it's not enough.
Well, I think our generation can say the slave trade and practice was abhorrent, and we should. We talk about our history, we can't change our history.
I understand from listening to people across the Commonwealth how the most painful aspects of our past continue to resonate. It is vital, therefore, that we understand our history.
The British King is also the head of the Commonwealth, an organisation representing most of the countries that were once the British Empire. At their summit earlier this year, the UK was under increasing pressure to pay reparations for its role in the slave trade. Starting in the 16th century, British colonies in West Africa were a source of people trafficked across the Atlantic to the Americas and put to work on plantations, helping Britain become a world leader in commodities like sugar and cotton. Later, it changed course, outlawing slavery in 1834 and spending decades using its navy to seize slave ships and end the trade by force. Britain also paid compensation to the owners of the slaves to help bring the practice to an end. But more than 200 years on, many are still demanding that today's British public pay financial reparations to the descendants of those who were enslaved.
Commonwealth leaders saying the time has come to discuss how the UK can atone for its part in slavery has indeed ignited a heated debate about what those reparations could look like, or even if they're necessary at all. We spoke to former BBC journalist and honorary fellow at the University of the West Indies, Laura Trevelyan, about how she dealt with her own family's links to slavery and whether the government should follow her example.
So I grew up not having any idea that my ancestors had profited from the transatlantic slave trade. And it all came to light, in fact, when University College London in about 2016 put online the database of all the compensation that was paid to Britain's slave owners when slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1834. Not the compensation that was paid to the former slaves. They didn't get anything. It was all Britain's slave owners that got money. So this was news to everybody in my family, to my father's generation, to mine. And we saw that the Trevelyan family had received compensation for their ownership of enslaved Africans on, in total, about 10 different plantations in Grenada from the mid-18th century until abolition. So this was shocking news to our family. I made a BBC documentary about it, about the reparations debate in Grenada, and discovered that in the Caribbean, there is a long-standing ask of the former colonial powers. There's something called CARICOM's 10-point plan for reparations. That begins with an apology for the transatlantic slave trade. And then CARICOM's asking the former colonial powers like Britain for investment in health and education and debt forgiveness. So working with leaders in Grenada, our family was told that an apology for slavery would be significant, that we could apologise for what our ancestors had done, and that, yes, we could also pay reparations. And so we went to Grenada in February of last year, and we did publicly apologise for the role of our ancestors in enslaving Africans in Grenada. And our family subsequently set up a charity I left my job at the BBC, and I've been advocating for the Caribbean's reparatory justice agenda since then. You can see the importance of this to other parts of the world. So I really think it's somewhere where Britain can lead. I understand people's reluctance to rake over the past for fear where it may lead, but I can honestly say with hand on heart, the experience of our family and working with people in Grenada has been nothing but positive.
So what do the great British public make of the growing calls for the UK to pay slavery reparations? We sent our producers to Brixton, the beating heart of the British Caribbean community in London.
The British government is like our father, it's like our mother, right? And I believe that whatever decision that they take is for our benefits. And if they say they are not doing a particular tax or a particular thing, it is for a purpose. It's for a reason.
Question, I think they should. I think they
Why should we pay reparations?
I don't know. I just think that we should. I was watching it on the news the other day and I was agreeing with what the politicians were saying.
We should definitely pay reparations. Like where does our wealth come from? It comes from like extracting it from like the rest of the world, either through like the direct colonialism of like the Victorian era before that, or like the kind of continuing structural effects of that. So the reason we get to live the way we do is because of the fact that we've taken money from elsewhere.
And we don't have to pay, but we have to apologize because it happened as a result of ignorance, and then even if we pay, it's not going to make any difference. So there won't be any point we paying, but we have to apologize.
If Britain are to pay reparations, it's going to come from taxpayers' money. So what you will have, a lot of it, a big portion of it, will be that the ancestors of people who are also would feel entitled in some parts to those reparations will then be paying the reparations and will also bear the weight and brunt of that.
Joining me here in the studio to discuss this are historian and broadcaster Rafe Heydel Mankoo and author and filmmaker Femi Nylander. Welcome to Westminster Watch, gentlemen. Femi, let me start with you. Paying reparations for a wrongdoing that's so distant in the past, many people feel it goes, if you like, our moral intuition of basically society, that the sins of the father should not be passed on to the descendants. Isn't that the case here with reparations?
Well, I mean, we say it so far in the past, but the truth is that we did pay reparations. We paid reparations to the slave owners, and we only stopped paying them 10 years ago, in 2015. So the idea that this is in the distant past is really a complete misnomer. We are talking about the recent past, and we're talking about money that is still in the hands of the UK and still in the hands of some particular families, and that the British taxpayer, the living British taxpayer, if you've been paying tax more than 10 years, you personally have been paying reparations to slave owners. You've been handing over money from your taxes to basically compensate British slave owners when they had to give up the human beings that they owned. So the idea that we can countenance and we can happily go along with paying off the slave owners, and we get up in arms about the idea of paying off the descendants, or even paying off the descendants of the slave owners, because as you rightly say.
It's a slightly more nuanced point than that, though, isn't it? Because, I mean, Rafe, there's a point here that the British government spent something like 40% of their GDP at the time to actually pay off the people who were imposing slavery, and yet those victims of it got nothing. I mean, it's not an unreasonable point to make, is it?
Well, actually, it is. Well, firstly, the point to make is, yes, Britain has more than paid its debt, not just by buying the freedom of the slaves, but also, of course, for expending 2% of GDP, a sum equivalent to our entire modern defence budget, on the West Africa Squadron, which enforced an end to the slave trade on the high seas, including seizing foreign ships and including, of course, stopping Africans from enslaving other Africans, because Africans were actually some of those who were most opposed to the ending of slavery.
So why the Brits?
But let me
let's just pick up on that point before we go down. Why are the Brits? Why are you picking on the Brits here when, in fact, there were slave people being gathered together in West Africa by people of their own country to sell slaves, which is when the Brits got
I
involved.
mean, you always have collaborators. We don't talk about Jewish collaborators with the Holocaust as a reason for Germany not to accept its historical crimes. And what we engage in the UK, when we go down these ridiculous lines of Britain should be proud of ending the slave trade, Britain should be proud of buying the freedom of the slaves. Can we just go back to that? That ridiculous point that the British government handing over large amounts of money to a few very wealthy British families who had benefited from the British slave trade is somehow buying the free. You're not buying the free. The British government should.
Right. We live in the real world, and the real world involves realpolitik. And the reality was, although Britain was the most advanced democracy in the world in the 19th century, it was far from the democracy we understand today. Let me finish the point, please. And so in 1833, the only way this legislation would have passed Parliament is if we paid the slave owners. It was that simple. No money for slave owners, it would never have passed through Parliament.
And that's the key point.
And this is the key point. And let me just finish the point. So when you consider we spent 40% of that amount of money of our budget in 1833, plus the amount spent on enforcing an end to the slave trade, it was the first time in human history that a power made itself deliberately poorer in order to advance a moral objective, because slavery is universal.
A key point, Femi, here, though, isn't it? It wouldn't have happened without the money.
We're talking about a government, and we're talking about citizens who were supposedly under that government. That government should have taken people who had engaged in human trafficking and murder and thrown people in the ocean and put them in jail. It shouldn't have given them a nice payout. You're talking supposedly about the authority. Well, it would never have passed Parliament because of the fact that the UK was a racist country that was enslaving people.
On a point of principle, you would rather people stayed in slavery.
You're making a complete false dichotomy.
No.
You're saying that the only two options of the British government at the time is to hand over a load of money to buy the human lives.
Laws work? Laws have to go through Parliament. Do you understand
what you're saying is it will never pass Parliament at the time. You're talking about an indictment of British politics.
You do understand the 1832 Reform Act.
Very enlightening discussion for some, but I do. No, Rafe. Let me bring this back to the present day, if I may, because you're clearly going to disagree on the fact of what the art of the possible was at the time. Politicians thought it was the right way to do it, but let's bring it forward, because some people are saying that slavery has caused economies in the Caribbean, particularly, to underperform as a result of slavery. They have not achieved their full potential. Is that still the substance of the argument why reparations should be paid today, even though no one who suffered under slavery is alive?
Well, this ties very well to another point that you make, which is the idea that no one who suffers under the effects of the European enslavement of the Caribbeans is alive today. European, and not just, and I do say European because Britain is part of Europe, but this is a widespread European project. European kind of dominance over the Caribbean lasted long after slavery. When we look at the structural adjustment loans that go into the 1980s and beyond, we're talking about basically loans given supposedly to former slaves, or well, not to former slaves, but to the countries which were formerly enslaved, which have horrifically debilitating conditions attached to them. And so these countries, they end up having to privatize everything, they end up having to liberalize their currencies, they end up having to do all sorts of stuff, which basically impoverish their countries to pay debt back, to pay interest,
but why
on
is
debt.
That a case for reparations?
No. All I'm saying is that Europe's exploitation of the Caribbean has lasted long beyond the initial moment of slavery. The reparations themselves...
But then there should be no reparations linked to slavery at all. What you're saying is you didn't like what the British government was doing in its colonies. That's completely different?
What I'm saying is that Britain and France and all the other countries which basically run the IMF and the World Bank have continued to exploit the Caribbean since the days of slavery, but that's a different point.
This is complete rubbish. This is just a way to excuse mismanagement of the Caribbean countries, and you can see it very clearly because those...
What are structural adjustment zones?
If you look at the territories in the region, the ones that are most successful are those that are still under British control. The British overseas territories are far more successful as existing colonies than the old colonies are. And actually, this whole idea that slavery has somehow impeded the Caribbean, I'm sorry, by every measure, the lives of descendants of slaves in the Caribbean are far better than if their ancestors had never left Africa.
The British tax
and you can see that because if you look at West Africa,
where
the life expectancy in, say, Benin in West Africa, where most slaves came from, is 12 to 15 years shorter than in the Caribbean, in Barbados
Benin
and so
was
forth.
also a victim of structural adjustment loans.
Average average GDP per capita in Benin is $1,400 a year. In Barbados, it's 17,000, more than 10 times higher. So by income level, by age, by life expectancy, by every measure, the lives of slaves today are far better.
Femi, let me take that point up with you, because actually isn't, if you like, when you look at the standard of living, the economic performance of some of the Caribbean countries now, really, when you take into account what Rafe said, isn't it a case that that's more down to the economic mismanagement of those countries in the Caribbean than anything else?
Rafe is comparing African countries who suffered much more recently British and French and Portuguese colonialism, which was massively debilitating. And I mean, I can go into the effects of colonialism, but we're supposed to be talking about reparations. So Rafe is basically affecting one region which has been exploited by Britain. Okay, well, can you please just let me finish? To another region which has been exploited by Britain, both of which are significantly poorer than the United Kingdom. Apart from, as he very well pointed out, some of these overseas territories which basically act as tax havens, where a lot of British companies hide a lot of their wealth, and the actual indigenous...
tax haven.
Which ones are tax havens?
I'm talking about places that are no longer British overseas territories.
You said British overseas territories.
Yeah, I was saying that they're actually better managed
because
than those countries.
They're not better managed. They just have higher GDP per capita because a load of companies and billionaires hide their wealth.
We have to measure countries by some pretty comparable factors like GDP per capita.
But the thing is, if the indigenous people of that area are still poor and a few billionaires hide their wealth there, what that's going to do is it's going to raise the GDP per capita.
Though? Rafe's rightly pointed to well-being is actually the health and life expectancy is better. What about the legal systems that they inherited from the British, from close? These are one of the reasons they've thrived, haven't they, compared to these other countries?
Essentially, as we say, this is essentially, and I don't like to use the term, but we have to use the term. If we look at how you would be treated if you went out and said we shouldn't look at the German Holocaust because of the fact that we have motorways, or look at all the good things that the Nazis did. You'd be run out of the room. However, it's perfectly acceptable in polite company in England to say, let's ignore the mass enslavement, the mass human trafficking, the mass rape and pillage
it was 200 years ago. You know, in 1972, when Muhammad Ali went to Zaire for the Rumble in the Jungle with George Foreman, and he's a black civil rights activist, an American journalist asked him, what do you think about Africa? He said, I'm just glad my granddaddy got on that boat.
The Commonwealth heads of government, quite interesting what happened at that meeting not so long ago. Keir Starmer is holding out against discussing reparations, despite a statement emerging from the Commonwealth's heads of government meeting, Femi. He believes that it's about looking to the future, not paying reparations. First of all, if he's not prepared to budge, it's not going to happen, is it? So shouldn't we, if there is any sense of compromise being made, should it be less about paying reparations and more about helping the Caribbean nations prosper who want to be helped further?
Here we come back to this question where supposedly political will is aligned with what should happen. We talk about should and we talk about can. A lot of people understand that Britain is not going to turn around tomorrow and say, here's your money back. If I steal your wallet, I'm not going to turn around. I've stolen it for a reason. I want to keep it. I'm not going to turn around and give it back to you. But the point to be made when it comes to whether, because Keir Starmer's not going to budge, should we turn away? We're talking about what should happen. We're not talking about what's going to happen.
The important point here is that slavery made a few families extremely wealthy, and you can see their stately homes. But it was a negligible impact on the UK economy as a whole. You know, in 1792, the key year for slavery in the sugar trade, you know, the sugar industry only amounted to 3% of capital formation. That's the same amount as barley and hops. No one says that beer fueled Britain's economy and so forth. Out of a population of millions, there were only a few thousand slave owners. If those slave-owning families today want to pay reparations, more power to them. But the majority of people in this country today descend from people who lived lives of abject poverty akin to serfdom. Why should they pay reparations when they still want to?
Well, I mean, you were making a good point for the wealthy ruling class of the UK to pay reparations to the poor people in the UK. But
16% of people in this country, all right, are from first, second, third generation immigrants to this country. Why should they be paying
First
tax?
of all, he's making a good case for redistribution of wealth and reparations paid to the descendants of the poor people in mining communities by the British ruling class as well, which I would support. But let's just dive in very quickly.
Answer his question.
Quickly. I come from Bolton. Well, I grew up in Bolton, near Wigan. Wigan, we used to go to Wigan, we used to look at the cotton mills in Wigan. We used to go and we'd talk about the British Industrial Revolution, and we'd go and visit the cotton mills. Where on earth does this man think the cotton came from for those cotton mills?
The cotton didn't come
You're not
from
really
the British...
answering my question,
That's
Femi.
not a British slave
Rafe,
issue.
Rafe,
You don't
sorry.
understand. It's American
Rafe,
slavery that cotton came from, for
Rafe,
heaven's sake.
let me press this point, because this idea that the British taxpayer should be paying it if they're responsible, I think it loses a lot of steam when you think that 16% of this population is made up of people who are first, second, third immigrants to this country. Why should they be paying?
Well, they're not going to be paying because most of the Caribbean people in the UK, because of the legacy of how Caribbean people came to the UK, basically as cheap labour in the Windrush generation, are some of the poorest people in the UK who are in some of the lowest tax brackets. So as a percentage of their income, they're barely going to pay.
You're saying the Indians and Chinese should pay, should they?
I'm saying that even Indian, well, most Indian people are in India. A few Indians are in the UK. We're talking about 16%. No, because you're making a completely...
Gentlemen, you have both gone off subject. It would be political suicide, wouldn't it, for Keir Starmer to actually agree to pay reparations? Or do you think a Labour government would pay?
I've no doubt that if Labour had the money, they would go down this line, because we have the most radically left government we've seen. This is a Prime Minister we've seen take the knee to BLM. We've seen him removing portraits of Elizabeth I, Sir Walter Raleigh, Prime Minister Glasson because of links to slavery. We've had a Foreign Secretary who seems to think Foreign Secretary means advancing foreign interests rather than British interests. So I've no doubt that he would if he could. But he knows, of course, it's political suicide, because the British people can understand quite clearly that, you know, reparations are fundamentally about putting the victim back into the position they were in before the harm was caused. There are no victims of slavery alive today. This is about victim culture and a cash grab by the Caribbean.
Point, all right, going back to the fact that there's no victims alive today, isn't it a touch offensive to compare horribly enslaved black people with those now who spent most of their life free, living in an independent state?
It's just a bit disingenuous, isn't it? That we have the idea that things can be passed on. We have the idea that wealth can be passed on. We even in this country, I have the idea that you can pass a crown on to the next person, and that because of who your mummy is, you can be the king and rule over everyone. Because of who your mummy is, because of who your granddaddy is, because of who your great-great-great-great-great-granddaddy is. But then when it comes to the idea that you're now much poorer than the average UK citizen in the Caribbean, even if you're a Caribbean person in the UK, much poorer than the average UK citizen.
You're not really answering my question, Femi. Do you not think that it is actually somewhat offensive to compare those who are living in an independent state?
You're not comparing them. You're saying that Jamaica, at the moment, is not one of the richest countries in the world. Britain is one of the richest countries in the world.
There's a lot of countries that are not the richest countries in the world
because of the fact that it has enslaved, because of the fact that it has colonised a quarter to half of the world.
We're running out of time, so Rafe, you want to let me deal with this. Why are these countries then, not all of them, are poorer than they should be? That's what Femi is saying. Is it all down to slavery?
Caribbean nations are middle-income countries that rank higher on the UN's Human Development Index than Brazil, than Mexico and South American countries. The reality is these are successful middle-income countries with 10 times the wealth of West Africa because of their British colonial inheritance. The English language, the common law have made them global players. The infrastructure of parliament, the judiciary, the civil service, the military. This isn't about slavery, because if it was about slavery, people like Femi would be campaigning against the 10 million Africans living in bondage today. The International Labour Organization says that
what is it
seven in every 1,000 Africans is a slave today.
What is it about?
This is an avaricious cash grab by governments, and it's a radical left-wing ideology by activists.
But it is morally bankrupt, isn't it? We can't escape the fact.
It's morally...
we paid, slave owners shed loads of money, and we didn't compensate those who suffered. That is something that is a stain on our history, isn't it?
No, because that guaranteed that we were
We
the
bought
first.
them their
We were the
freedom.
first power in history to make ourselves poorer to advance a moral good. The real moral bankruptcy is complaining about things from 200 years ago, rather than protesting
this is
outside.
Holocaust denial.
Rather than
what
protesting
essentially you're
outside the
engaging in.
embassies of Niger, Cameroon, with 800,000 slaves today.
You're minimising
Hundreds of slaves are
a
sold
Holocaust.
every week in Libya, according to CNN.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for one of the most lively conversations we've had recently. I fear we found no common ground whatsoever, but I'm very grateful to you both joining me. Femi Heydel, thank you very much indeed for joining me. Rafe, Heydel, Mankoo, thank you for your contribution. And don't forget to subscribe to the TRT World YouTube channel for more lively debate and conversation as you witnessed here. But for now, from me and all the team, goodbye and thank you for watching.